everybody. Welcome to Holy Foley. I'm Dr. Vanessa Theme Ament, and my guest today is Dr. Gabriel Paletz, who is at Prague Film School and teaches film and screenwriting. He recently had an essay, which I read and loved, in a special issue of the peer-reviewed journal, The Soundtrack. Welcome, Gabriel. It's a delight to meet you. I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic because I've had some experience with it, talked about it with friends of mine in the industry and with academic friends. I'm curious what got you interested in thinking about sound in screenplays.
First, thanks for having me, Vanessa, here. It's a pleasure, and I'm so looking forward to our talk. I went to USC having always loved film, and and I should say, just before I went to USC, I was actually on a film set at the National Film School in Beaconsfield, England, working in art direction on student films. So when I went to USC, there was always this bit of production, or as you said in previous podcasts, this fascination with process
Mhm.
um, that I had developed, and that convinced me at USC not just to do critical studies, sort of the theoretical historical part, but also to argue to do more production that was usually given to people on that track. So I earned the first PhD with a minor in film production, first PhD in film history and theory with a minor in film production. And then the lure of Prague called, as Kafka said, referring to Prague as a little mother. The little mother has claws in us and will not let us go. So there is something about being here, the charms of the city.
So, in this last bit, when you left USC and went to Prague, what year would that have been?
That was in the early 2000s already. My goodness.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you're deeply entrenched in that culture now. And are you fluent in Czech?
I'm I am fluent. I am fluent. And it is not an easy language to be fluent in, let me
No,
tell
it's
you.
not. What prompted you to start getting interested in teaching screenwriting and then this I want to get to this course that tickles me. Um, Learning from awful films. I, I
Yes.
like that.
Thank you for mentioning that. First, I should say, just before we leave the Czech language, I should say that some of the sounds in it would make wonderful Foley, actually. There's a particular letter of which the Czechs are very proud because it doesn't exist in any other language. And it's a sort of R, a very harsh R that sounds like R. And it's a wonderful kind of almost of sound effect in itself.
Yeah. So when I listen to it, it's like you say it's R, but it sounds like je or
Yes, it's something in between. It's a R that goes to je with a little
okay.
with a stop in between. But all of this within microseconds. So
Ugh,
yes, and it's a point of Czech patriotism.
appreciating the way they say it. Um, it becomes particularly beautiful about what humanity can do because so often we are hit in the face with the vicious, ugly, brutal things humanity can do. But then there is this other side where humanity can create such beauty out of things that seem so simple, like a word, and the way it can caress a word and make it something truly artful.
I think it was H.L. Mencken who said that American English is the most impatient dialect of English because we're always condensing things, turning nouns into verbs, trying to get on with it, do it faster, and putting
Yeah.
things together. The Czech language, I think, lends itself to a kind of to ironic humor, which is a specialty of that's something the country is known for, which I think is it's a chicken and egg question because it just comes out naturally in the language, the way it's spoken and the way you can use the language.
Now, see, people might think that doesn't have anything to do with performative sound, but it actually does. It all starts with something sonic for me. And when I was talking to Sarah Pinheiro, who is from Portugal, but is now in Prague, where you are, um, and she talked about reducing. the reduction and reducing sound to its very, very basic, core, which I love to do. And a Foley artist has to naturally do that in order to think about how it's used in its particular space, whether it be attached to something visual or not, as she uses it, not attached to something visual. I like to think that if you really stop to think about what it sounds like when you're speaking, instead of just saying something sloppily, when you think about intention of when you're speaking or singing or making any kind of sound, and it does become performative, then you become actually more aware, more mindful, more responsible for it. And that makes it performative. And so if I now take a leap and I want to go back to your course because that's where I was beginning. But when you take the leap and you think about putting sound into a screenplay, then you start going where you were in your article in this edition of Soundtrack. I'll just signpost for our audience that you have several suggestions about how that would happen, and some of it are visual cues and other things like that. But before we do that, I do want to flip back to learning from awful films. I want to know what made you think of that and how you approach that class, because I want to be a student in that class.
Ah, well, you're welcome.
Oh,
Well,
sign me up.
you're you're very welcome. It's one of the advantages of teaching in the Prague Film School is that we're able to initiate these kinds of original courses. And the inspiration for this course was you're always trying to think, a conscientious teacher, like a conscientious speaker, is always trying to think of the effects of their and how to communicate more effectively.
Mhm.
And so it struck me that students were really talking very enthusiastically about these terrible films that they had seen, and I was thinking, is there a pedagogical possibility here? Can we take their love, enjoyment of terrible films, and then can we use that to actually teach something, to think more deeply about films? And it's turned into a very nice and fruitful way of discussing all kinds of aspects of filmmaking, that definitely including sound, because we feature they can tell with the awful films that are awful with sound how important sound is,
Yeah,
even more than other aspects of filmmaking. It makes them cringe even more to see terrible films with sound. So
yeah.
that brings home what they take for granted in competent films.
Hmm. When I think of, I'm going to mention a film that's an awful film, and that would be The Room, um, which my son and I saw, and then we saw the narrative film about The Room. And it's such a cult classic, and it's just so much fun because it's just so awful. Um, and I, because I'm an actor and I like to go around being silly and goofy, sometimes I'll just go, "Oh, hello, doggy," or, you know, any of the lines just to be funny and silly. Even a terrible film, if the sound is decent, is less terrible. Good Foley, for example, because we hear before we see, can actually make an experience better in film.
Oh, that's the whole point of the course, which, by the way, begins with The Room.
Oh, God.
And we have them rewrite the scene with the doggy.
Okay. Well,
Because
hello,
even
doggy.
yes, exactly that scene. Because in that scene, even though you can hear the dialogue, there's no problem with hearing the dialogue, but the dialogue seems to actually be divorced from the interaction. People are saying, you hear the lines of dialogue, but people are not looking at each other. They're not noticing each other. And all of a sudden, the students go, wait, why is this happening? And it's a reflection that people can work on separate crafts, but ideally in a film, those crafts come together into a seamless whole. But on a bad film like The Room, the crafts also seem to be walking away from each other.
She's a sociopath. She can't love anyone.
There is no baby.
I told him that to make it interesting.
She's such a manipulative witch.
You're hurting yourself. You're hurting our friendship.
I treat you like a princess, and you stab me in the back.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Hey, Danny.
Where's my money, Danny?
Put the gun down.
What the hell is wrong with you? Just shut up.
Hey! Get out of this world!
The Room, a film with the passion of Tennessee Williams, directed by Tommy Wiseau. The best movie of the year. Experience this quirky new black comedy. It's a riot.
So the performances are separate from the sound recording and things like, and you know, those parts of the process do not cohere in that scene. And so then the question to the students is, what would you need to change so that it did cohere to become the kind of scene that you're used to? And then they notice the importance of looks in film. Then they notice the importance of matching gesture and how gesture and dialogue go together. You know, watching a bad film is like literally an analysis because it just breaks down all the things that usually function as a whole.
Your essay in soundtrack, which frankly I thought was compacted and could actually be, I mean, if you wanted to, and I know you probably have thought about it, there's an entire book in so many things that could be said about this, but I wanted to get into this because I think it's a fascinating idea. And I will tell you a couple of anecdotes on the practitioner side that leads me into this because it made me think so much how screenwriters, and that's why your article, your essay intrigued me. When I was working on Platoon, we watched the first reel and I turned to the people in the booth, and there were 3 women that did the Foley on Platoon. I hired 2 of the women to work with me on it, Allison Moore and Hilda Hodges. And I turned to everybody. I turned to my mixer, Richard Rogers, and I said, this movie's going to get Best Picture. Now, I don't always predict things like this, but sometimes I just get a hit. And it's just the first reel. It's the introductory reel with the titles that later the title reel. But we also had the screenplay in front of us. And Oliver Stone had written in some Foley cues. And some sound cues in his screenplay. And I'd never seen that before.
How interesting.
He didn't do it all the way through. But he did put a few in. And I really thought that was interesting. And I thought and you know, he'd written screenplays before, but he hadn't, you know, he'd just directed Salvador, which he was on another stage working on the ADR with another sound friend of mine, David Udall. And I remember commenting, I wonder why more screenwriters don't think about this. Because he hadn't directed. Directing was new to him. He was thinking as a screenwriter. And I remember thinking, I wonder why more screenwriters don't think about some of the sound things that might be in this. So then when I spoke to my friends who worked with the Coen brothers, and I wrote about Barton Fink, because I love the Coen brothers' work, I learned that the Coen brothers include a great deal about the way they want sound used in their screenplays. And they actually go on the Foley stage and they actually work very closely with sound people because and you can tell with their films that the use of sound is extremely integrated in their storytelling. And they do put sound notes and they have the story told a lot through what's happening sonically. And then I have one more story, which is personal, and that was when I worked on Noises Off. When Bogdanovich wrote the screenplay and directed Noises Off, the script had that two-sided way of writing that you talk about in your essay, where the sound that's happening on stage is one side of the script that you designate in your essay. And the other side of the script is what I'm responsible for doing in Foley and some of the sound effects happening backstage that I'm doing. He had to duplicate what was happening in a theatrical performance because it had been a stage play.
Right. By Michael Frayn. Was that done in a multi-column format, in a
Yes,
dual column format?
it was. And so that was the only time I'd seen it happen.
So let's actually address that very relevant question you ask of why screenwriters tend not to write sound. And I think it's because it's such an important question, and we should really just try and let's break down some of the reasons at least. My essay is called Writing Sound in the Screenplay Traditions and Innovations. Part of the reason why screenwriters tend not to write sound nowadays is they feel separated from those traditions of writing sound in screenplays because they existed all over, and all in very different countries and industries. Particularly, of course, when sound came in as a new technology, when it was a promotion as well as a very novel, important technical component of new sound films, like in the United States in the late 1920s, but also in musicals. We could talk about different countries, but there's a whole slew of traditions, but that screenwriters don't feel connected to when they write only in the master scene format.
Right.
Master scene Hollywood screenplay format. So those traditions are but they're very rich and they're there. And so the essay introduces some of those or brings them back to screenwriters' attention. Another reason I think screenwriters don't write sound is there's no real place for it, actual physical place for it in the master scene script. There's a place where you write descriptions where you could include sounds, but it's fighting with all these other descriptions, most of which are visual, right? So that's why in the essay, there's the suggestion, why don't we add a very important sound, which is crucial to the drama of the scene, in the slug line?
Right.
Why does the slug line only have to include interior, exterior, location, and time of day? And I'm sure there are other places. The two-column format that you spoke of is an even better example, because there is a whole side of the page devoted to sound, and so to screenwriters, what are you going to put there? And then the very form of the script compels you to imagine sounds and telling a story in sound.
I also think there's another piece here. Most screenwriters are in pre-production, and then sometimes they get included in production if they get to be in the rewrite part of it or they get to be around the shooting. But they're not schooled typically in what happens in post. So part of the issue, I believe, is that they don't know what we do. And if they know what we do, or they understand, or they're privileged enough to be on set or be included in what happens in post, then their imaginations can be included more in what they would do in a script. Now, you've had the privilege of being in film school, but I wonder if a lot of the reason that there is this bifurcation is just in the nature, especially in Hollywood, of separating out skills with the above the line and the below the line, where the people who are working in sound are usually below the line and not even touching forks with people with the screenplay, the screenwriters and the directors and the people that come before us. So we see what they do because it all comes to where we are. We're the last thing, and we see everything that everybody does. And we know how it all works together in post. Maybe we need a change in how we approach the collaboration being so segmented and separate.
You could, yes, I think that's absolutely true. And another way of putting it would be to return and go back to the way that Hollywood used to work, because before the early sound era, it was much more fluid
Yes.
during the silent era. And that's why you have famous. I did a program about the great female screenwriters of Hollywood silent period.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were editors as well, or at least part of the cutting room. They were certainly on set, and they had that general filmmaking knowledge that you were just speaking of. It was only really after the sound era and guilds and that this segmentation settled in. And what you say absolutely can work both ways. Because if screenwriters knew more about how Foley artists work, sound editors work, composers work, how much richer their story ideas would be. And
Yes.
likewise, if Foley artists, composers, sound editors were brought in into earlier phases of production, how much more time they could have to refine their ideas and to become really integrated into the whole process of filmmaking. And that has happened. Also, I think nowadays, exceptional directors realize the importance of sound, and I'll give just two examples, one from the classical period and one from, I guess, 5 years ago now. So during the making of Citizen Kane, film, celebrated film, Orson Welles brought Bernard Herrmann in during shooting so he could compose as the scenes were literally being shot and composed. So his music could be that much better timed and integrated into the making of the film. And I think the seamlessness of the music in that film shows, I think, the benefits of treating a production like that. And as I remember, for The Souvenir, which I think is a film from 2019, they did what the director and sound designer called a sonic storyboard, right? It's a film about memories and about memories. So that was done, at the same time that they began to design the visual imagery of the film. So I think savvy filmmakers who understand the importance of sound are changing and overcoming that segmentation that we were just talking about.
I also can think of Sergio Leone and Morricone because when I think about Once Upon a Time in the West, the score is on the set. He's playing the score on the set and they're walking to it and saying their lines to a recorded the score. And the only reason the opening scene is different is because Morricone had gone to a performance art of a man working with a ladder. And he got the idea, because the opening scene wasn't working, of having the sounds done and that the scene was shot to the sounds. And the idea of the sound dictating the pacing of that film is something they'd wanted to try. And that integration is one of the reasons that film comes across the way it does. And a lot of countries try a lot of different things with filmmaking because they're not locked into the same system as the United States. And what I'm finding is that it's the United States that stays locked into a system more than a lot of the European and Asian countries, especially European. I find so much more innovation going on across the pond over in your neck of the woods. I think when a system gets too rigid, too fixed, it lessens its ability to be innovative. But when you get to some of these countries outside of what we're used to here in Hollywood, when you get to other places, they aren't so rigid in the way they try things. So that might be why how some of these things might get done with putting sound in a screenplay too. When you bring in people who are wanting to try something different. I want to go back to what I said a while ago, where I think there's actually kind of a book in what I thought might have been your initial treatise on various ways you might include putting sound in a screenplay, because when I was reading it, I thought, boy, this is the beginning of what could be opening up a whole method of rethinking screenwriting in a lot of ways. There's a way that a screenwriter might stop situating themselves somewhere in a room with a word processor and really be thinking about, I wonder where the music cues might come in. I wonder where, and just revolutionize it and maybe stir everything up a little bit so that we aren't so segmented, because I think actors automatically do that because they're really relational. But having been someone myself who's been in the acting side of it and the music side of it and the sound side of it, I see how the different areas of expertise approach the work of filmmaking a little differently. So you got me thinking about that. And also really did like the two column approach, because I saw how Bogdanovich did that, and I thought that was really interesting. There's a lot here that I think can be expanded upon. Do you teach this in any of your classes?
Oh, absolutely.
And does it help your students open up the way they want to write?
Very much so. And that's part of the inspiration that you are giving me now, because I am writing a screenwriting book and I devote a whole chapter to the writing of sound, which I have not seen, at least in other sort of English language screenwriting guides. But when you teach enough young filmmaking students, I should say, I mean, it's two things. First, the young filmmaking students, and you see what happens to their sound when they don't think about it until post-production, being young filmmakers, you realize that it's very important and crucial to them to give them the way to write sound as early on as possible in their filmmaking, because their films will just be that much better when
Yes.
they can do that. And so that's one inspiration. The other thing that I should say, speaking of film schools, going to the University of Southern California, I mean, it has this fantastic sound department when I was there. And of course, so much innovative things were done out of that school in terms of Hollywood sound in particular. It's not the only reservoir of innovation. But then what happens to it, what's so interesting is that it's a constant mix between innovation and industrial consolidation. And what we have to do as screenwriters and as filmmakers is to keep that dynamic alive. So the industrial consolidation and the tendency to repeat things based on previous successes and the pressures of time and money does not completely crush the innovative spirit. And that's why, I'm trying as a teacher and in writing a screenwriting book to include topics like sound, like pacing, and to treat traditional topics in new ways. Traditional topics like character, structure. How can we think about them not just as an arrangement of events, but in terms of the flexibility of screenwriting and our ability to create all kinds of different story shapes based on the length of scenes and other factors, because screenwriting is a unique form of writing in many ways, but most of all in the fact is that it is writing which is translated into images and sounds as its final expression.
I think that's a beautiful way to say it. It's I don't know that there's a better way to express what this can all be about.
So that's one of the first things that I try and tell students is, yes, you are putting words onto paper, but your final means of expression will be in images and sounds. So just think about that when you're writing. When you're writing, what eventually are we going to see and hear? And I think that's very important that they understand that early on, so that they don't just think of people speaking, they don't just think of one event following another, but they think of what is actually going to appear on screen and through the speakers to their audiences.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this conversation. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for this.
Well, we can go on about sound and Foley for much longer, as you will in your next episode. So thanks very much for this, for our
Thank
talk,
you.
Vanessa.
Thank you, Gabriel.